timelines, that these Gospels have similar events, and sometimes even similar language. They will almost quote one another word for word. And so I've included a couple examples of that in the PowerPoint. You can look up the class PowerPoint that I will email out to all of you. And in this, we can see that there are 3 of them that do agree, as I said before. Those 3 are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke absolutely agree with one another. However, one very interesting thing is that Mark was written first. And Mark does not have some of the same stories that Matthew and Luke possess. Matthew and Luke have some stories that are not found in any other gospel. They are only found in these 2. However, we wonder, where did that come from? If these Gospels are all so similar that they will quote one another occasionally, then why does Matthew and Luke, why do these 2 Gospels have material in them that we don't find in any of these other Gospels? And so I want to give you an example of that really quickly. Please open up your books and please open to Luke 6, verses 17 through 22, and put a little bookmark in that. And then after you have that marked, which again is Luke 6, 17 through verse 22, look up Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Again, Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And just read over those very quickly. I will give you a moment to read over those while I erase the board, and we can be prepared to talk about those in just a moment. Okay, so if you have read those 2 sections, I will tell you what those sections are called. Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 22, that is called the Sermon on the Plain. And we have Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, that is called the Sermon on the Mount. If you see anything similar in those sections, you will see that that is just one example of a story of Jesus that is found only in Matthew and Luke, that is found in no other gospel. And we wonder, as you can see, there are many similarities between these 2 historical accounts, or at least between these 2 pieces of literature. You can see there's the Beatitudes, or that section that says, blessed art the poor in spirit. You can see there's a lot of similarities. And so we wonder, where exactly did this material come from in Luke and Matthew that we don't see it in Mark? And so we also think that we can look toward a timeline and we can get some information from there about maybe some answers to this big question. So we realize, again, that Mark was written first. If Mark was written around 66 to 70, then we acknowledge that Matthew and Luke had to come afterwards. We'll go over the exact dates when Matthew and Luke were written a little bit later, whenever we're studying those Gospels individually, but they were written in a very similar time period, several years apart, but very close in time. And so we do know that because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, that Matthew and Luke must have used Mark as a source. Matthew and Luke must have read Mark, and they must have said, oh, well, this is some really interesting information. We are going to use some of Mark in our own Gospels. So from here, we have later on in time, after Mark is written, we have Luke, and we have Matthew. Both of these authors using Mark as source material for their own Gospels. However, One theory that we will talk about is called the Q-source hypothesis. The Q-source theory. Okay, this Q-source hypothesis refers to again, it's only a hypothesis, it has not been proven, but some biblical scholars are led to believe that there is a mysterious document, a source that has been lost through time, but that the authors of Luke and Matthew would have known. So, around the same time period as Luke and Matthew were written, there would have been this Q source. And so Luke and Matthew would have read Mark and the Q source, both of these documents, and they would have based their Gospels off of both of these documents. It's like when you're writing a research paper or you're studying for some sort of research and you find one source and then you find another source. You base your essay or your resource off of several different studies, off of several different sources. That's how Luke and Matthew were operating. They were using Mark as one source, and they were using the Q source as another source. And because these two authors, hypothetically, according to some scholars, may have used both of these sources, that it really does a lot to explain the differences that we see between Luke, Matthew, and Mark, but also the similarities. It explains that Luke and Matthew would have been writing from the same two sources, so it explains why they would have had these stories, these quotations, these parables that we don't see in Mark, because if we go along with this hypothesis, Luke and Matthew would have gotten that information from the Q source. However, it also makes sense that Luke and Matthew would have been quoting as well from Mark, because Mark, Luke, and Matthew do have many similar characters, similar stories, similar quotations. And so this concept of the Q-source theory, makes a lot of sense whenever we are trying to analyze these three synoptic gospels. Now, what does synoptic mean? We talked about before technically what it means, but I'll give you the technical definition and that may help you recall it. To actually be synoptic is to be seen through one eye. You can think of optic. Optic means relating to the eye. Synoptic, one singular eye, one singular topic. So maybe that will be a mnemonic that can help you all think about these three Gospels, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, that are very, very similar. And now we'll cover John and we'll cover why he is a little bit different a little bit later. And so we have made a lot of headway today. We have talked about a review of what we've already covered about chapters 1 and chapters 2. We've talked about the historical background of this situation, especially in relation to this concept of language, of Koine Greek, and how that's really important when we analyze literature. We talked about the gospel subjects, how Mark is concerned with encouraging people who may be persecuted to remain with the faith, to be strong and to be willing to suffer for your beliefs, just like Christ was willing to suffer and to hypothetically die for his beliefs. We learned about Matthew and how Matthew addresses this concern of priestly corruption, of corruption within the church, of corruption within the government, and how it tries to argue for Jesus as being the Messiah by using prophecy from the Old Testament. We talked about Luke, and we talked about how Luke is all about social justice. Luke is very concerned with trying to make people who are poor, who are women, who are diseased, who are socially oppressed in some way. Luke is trying to address those people who are socially oppressed. And Luke is trying to tell those people that they are accepted, and he's trying to open the folds of Christianity to accept these outsiders, even Gentiles. And we, of course, talked about John. And we talked about how John is a little different in that due to its later writing, it shows a very different theology, a view of Christ, than some of these earlier Gospels did. We talked about how John's main purpose is to show Christ as this cosmic, eternal, God-like figure, and is trying to proclaim the coming of Christ and who Christ is. And so we've covered all of this information. We talked about the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, and how they're so similar. And we've talked about that synoptic problem here, how Mark is a little different than Luke and Matthew, how Luke and Matthew have stories that are not found in Mark. And we talked about one of the many different historical possibilities that a lot of historians, a lot of biblical scholars think that may address this situation. The Q source theory, that there is another document besides Mark that Luke and Matthew were writing from. That's where they found those similar stories. So we've covered a lot of information today. If you look on your class PowerPoint, you will see an introduction to some of the new information that we'll be covering specifically in Matthew, although you got a little gist of what you can expect whenever you read Mark yourself. So if you read Mark, we'll be covering Matthew a little bit later on. We'll be covering Luke after that, of course, and John even after that. So thank you so much for coming today. You can go ahead and pack your bags. And thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.